This episode of Nos Arietes is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Arietes since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest.
Hey, this is Christian Roldan.
And Jordan Morris from the Seattle Sounders Football Club.
And you're listening to...
This is Nos Arietes.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
A sideline fry! The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Rui Diaz through the middle to crown it for Seattle! And now they truly can start the celebrations. It's the Sounders MLS Cup.
Nicoladero leaves absolutely no doubt! The Sounders rule the region!
Seattle Sounders is good.
Seattle Sounders, the greatest MLS team in history.
They've scored! They've scored! Finally!
This feels fucking awesome.
This is a tiny dog.
Is that what you young people call twerking?
And Paul can't say it's cheating.
You want to win? Let's see on the Sunday, bro.
North Seattle!
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Nos Arietes, brought to you by Full Pull Wine, Watson's Counter, and all of our wonderful subscribers. This is episode 421, and we are recording on August 1st, 2023. My name is Aaron Campo, and I'll be your host for today. If you're wondering why you're stuck with me, it's because Jeremiah is currently on vacation. And speaking of vacation, the Seattle Sounders are also on vacation after a disastrous Leagues Cup campaign, which saw them lose both games to RSL and Monterey by a combined score of 7-2. We'll get into all of that unpleasantness as well as what it might mean going forward. But first, I'd like to introduce my co-host for today's show. You know him, you love him. It's our good friend, Mark Kastner. Mark, how are you this afternoon?
Oh, I'm doing fine. As long as I don't think too much about the last two Sounders games.
Yeah, I'm trying not to do that too much. I mean, I guess the next hour or so will be unpleasant in that regard. But, if we can just wash our hands of it.
Maybe we can treat it like a therapy session and we'll feel better afterwards.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Let's get to it. Everybody knows what happened. No sense in dwelling too much on the RSL game, in my opinion. The less said, the better for that one. I think one of the worst performances of the season. Just a nothing performance. And I don't know if you have any observations you'd like to make. Any takeaways from it? For me, just the culmination of, I think, one of the most unpleasant periods of Sounders fandom in recent memory.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm sure if you really kind of dug into it over the past decade plus, there's probably been worse periods. I'm sure. The end of 2013 or the first half of 2016, statistically, all that, there have been worse periods. Excuse me. But in terms of vibe, it's really nasty what we're kind of in right now. And I don't even know if it's helpful to be oh, it's been worse, or they're actually better than they are. Right. It's just we're going on a year plus of this really, really turgid experience.
Right.
And what this team used to be really great at was responding, and they're not responding anymore. Either the manager says, Brian Spencer says, you will expect a different performance against Monterey than RSL. And that lasted for 5 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
And Monterey's a way better team than RSL.
For sure.
But still, it's just we're kind of entering Boy Who Cried Wolf territory, where it's how can you blame or disagree with the worst detractors now? Because it's just sort of yeah, this is really unpleasant.
Yeah, and I think, we've got some time dedicated to this in the second segment that will, I think, really dive into the specifics of this. But to me, I think that Brian Schmetzer is saying those things because in the past, like you said, that's been a promise that I think that they could keep. I think that there were adjustments that could be made. I think that, tactical tweaks, putting a boot up asses, right? Like that kind of stuff worked in the past. I don't think that those are the issues now. I think that that's a fundamentally different issue with this squad, with this team and where they're at. And, and I think for me, that's why it feels so rough, because 2013 you mentioned as a pretty rough time, and it was a pretty rough time, but it was rough largely because there was a really poor collection of personalities on that team. There were some weird roster issues that I think everyone knew would get worked out, and it was a really frustrating end to the season, but I think people knew there were better days ahead. And there were, right? 2014 at that time was the best season in club history, still the best regular season in club history. 2016, kind of similar, right? Like there was a lot of turnover happening. We knew there was most likely a big signing coming. A lot of the really bad times in 2016 were just because there were so many players out injured and things like that. And then, there was decisive action taken and moving on from Ziggy. And so there was you felt like, okay, maybe this season is a wash. Obviously it didn't turn out that way, but even at the time it felt like this is an exciting new era. And I think there's a chance that we'll get to that point eventually with this team. But right now, I mean, we've still got 11 games left. For me, it would almost be somewhat easier if this season were over and done with. If we knew that they were not going to make it into the playoffs without some kind of freak accident or, completely unforeseen run. That's not the case, which again, we'll get into later in the show. But it's just a bummer of a time right now. The RSL game, I think, was really the apex of that. Then the Monterey game, first 5 minutes of that game, the attack did look legitimately great. I mean, there was a totally different energy. And I think even really until Monterey's penalty that ended the first half, the Sounders looked completely capable of getting that third goal and at least making it interesting. I think they ran out of gas after Monterey's goal. I mean, they had some decent moments in the second half. They had some really frustrating moments in the second half, the likes of which we've kind of gotten accustomed to this season. But ultimately, it just felt like the wind came out of their sails after that penalty, and that was all she wrote.
Yeah, I think like the team is never, at least this season, and I would even say like, I think like you said, they're fundamentally different problems, and I don't want to attribute too much of this to actually what happened last season, but there are sort of like, there's a bunch of evidence that this team should be much better than they are. Obviously, we don't kind of need to go into that, but the way that I kind of look at it, sort of like with like a tactical analysis hat on, is the patterns of play to create opportunities and to prevent opportunities from the opponents are like an inch deep and a mile wide.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like a glass jaw, like if anybody's familiar with like boxing terminology, like it works until it really doesn't work. And then there's nothing you can do about it. And that's just like, we've seen this game like almost 20 times this season where it's like, if it works really well and it's awesome and it's a lot of fun and it's great and that, but as soon as it doesn't work, an opponent can hang in there for 15 minutes and sort of like gum up everything. And then the momentum completely shifts and there's just no other option. Like Monterey's first goal was just one of the easiest goals scored against the Sounders all year, just because they knew if they could like hold on to the ball for 15 seconds that the Sounders midfield wouldn't actually pressure them.
Yep.
They get passed through. Yamar's somewhere else, like effectively he's grabbing a hot dog or something, and they just score. And it's just like, oh, okay, that's it. And then, I mean, we'll probably get into like the stupidness of all the other 3 goals, especially the penalty, but it's just like, it's on one hand, like I think most of the blame rests on the coaching staff, but on the other hand, it's just like, if you have these like really excellent patterns of play offensively and defensively, or just like holistically, which I do think the Sounders do have mostly, and then the players just do really stupid things all of the time to prevent those patterns from really like setting in.
Yeah.
I don't blame the coaches for being like exasperated at this point.
Yeah, I think that there's plenty of blame to go around with this team, right? I'm not letting anybody off the hook. Coaching staff, playing staff, training staff, whatever, front office to some degree as well. But I do think you're right that the tactical approach a lot of the time is working. Now, that inability to make adjustments when it's not working, that's a major concern. I do think, I think Brian Schmetzer still is a very good coach. But one of the criticisms I've had of him, even when times were good, is, I think that he has this mentality, and to some degree I understand it, that it's the whole we're the Seattle freaking Sounders thing, right? Like we're going to go out and we're going to play the way we play. And, we're good enough to do that. Right now, I don't think they are good enough to do that. Now, the situation they were in against Monterey is, I think, it's fair to bring up that this wasn't a game where a 1-0 gets you through. They had to go for it. And Monterey is built to do exactly what they did against the Sounders, which is pick them apart on the counter. So to some degree, I can understand how that ends up happening in this particular game. But it's not just Monterey that it's happened against. It's a lot of other teams, as you alluded to. It's been a very common thing this season. And, I think that a little bit more cynicism tactically would be a good thing at times. And I think that, a little bit less bluster would be a good thing at times. This team's not very good right now. They're not the Seattle freaking Sounders. They're, barely the Seattle Sounders. And I think a lot of that, as you sort of alluded to, is the players doing very stupid things. Albert Rosenak's penalty. This one, I maybe am on an island about. I thought was a stone cold nailed on penalty. I think a pretty.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a little bit of a shove on Rosenak, but I don't think that was a huge factor in the play. I think he just makes a poor decision, and I think also the pass to him was a poor decision as well. You alluded to Yamar just going on walkabout. I also thought Joao Paulo did a pretty poor job tracking the runner there. Just mistakes that for a team with this much experience and this much success, right? Like, it's not like these are veterans who have always been prone to really bad mistakes. These are guys that you don't expect to make these mistakes. And they're making them pretty consistently. I just don't think their head is in a great place. And, when the margins are fine, that can really cost you. And the margins were not especially fine in this game after halftime. Monterey just punished the Sounders. And, to be fair to Monterey and to the Sounders, this is one of the best teams in CONCACAF, not the best team in CONCACAF right now. They destroyed RSL. Like I said earlier, I think in a vacuum, this is not a terrible result. Monterey is just a much better team than the Sounders right now, a much more talented team. But because, it's the hope that kills you, right? Sounders came out, put up 2 goals really quickly, looked like they were going to get a third before Monterey's first goal. And then all of the other games, right? Like if the Sounders were in first place in the West, good form in the league, I think it'd be very frustrating to go out this early for reasons that we'll get to later on. But, they're not, right? Like this is been a bad team since May, and this didn't make me feel great. And sort of in that vein, in the notes I took for the RSL game that got kind of tossed out because nobody wants to talk about it, I said, I no longer think this team is capable of competing. I think the early preseason and the in-season regression from key but aging players means that this version of the team is closer to their potential than the April version of the team. After that first 5 minutes, I was kind of second guessing myself. something we've seen a lot this year has been Nico Ladero on short rest looks like a black hole, a net negative at times, I think, for the team, like worse than replacement level. On full rest looks a lot better. And I think even after this game turned, Nico still looked pretty good in this game. So I don't know. I don't maybe feel quite as strongly as I did, but I'm not super optimistic about the rest of the season. And you know, again, we'll get into this later on in the second segment, but I necessarily as bad as they've looked, certainly not as bad as they've looked against RSL. But I do think that when you look at the underlying numbers and say, well, you know, there are reasons for optimism here, I think that's true to some degree until it's not. And I think I've kind of reached the point where it's not, like where those underlying numbers don't mean a whole lot to me because other teams are letting the Sounders create those patterns of play and looking for the opportunities that the Sounders haven't been able to stop defensively because they know that they're not in much danger. And I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because one of the consistent themes, although I think less consistent as the season has gone on, has been this is a good team, this is a talented team, they're underperforming their expected results, and the odds are pretty good if they keep doing these things, that's going to turn around. And I'm less and less convinced of that.
Yeah, I think the sort of the gut reaction to things like that is you kind of look at everything in sort of isolation, where you go, oh, you know, against so-and-so, they created this amount of XG, or, you know, they created decent chances. You know, they should have scored X, Y, and Z goals. Like, you know, there was a lot of conversation about the Monterrey game where it was like Raul Ruiz had like basically 3 one-on-one opportunities with the goalkeeper, didn't score any of them. And then several other chances where you would expect him to walk out of that game with a hat trick. It's the way that I look at this is it's so much less about looking at the numbers in sort of a cut and dry way and being like, they should have won that game because they created more XG. If you take a step back and you kind of look at the underlying numbers in tandem with the holistic approach the team has had over the summer, I agree with you. I am not optimistic that things get better. I think they can kind of like white knuckle it.
Yeah.
And we've seen them literally white knuckle their way into an MLS Cup.
Right.
They've white knuckled their way to 2 MLS Cups and they won one of them.
Yeah.
And that, like, I'm referencing 2020 and 2016 in terms of that. And so that works. That totally works with this league. But where I get really pessimistic is the team has been garbage for several months, and the coaching staff does not seem interested in trying anything different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, they have talented players that could come in. I know they've been dealing with injuries in key areas, but Josh Atencio can play. Reed Baker-Whiting can play. Dylan Tevez can play. Aver can play. You can do different things with different players and try to change something. You can just be like, screw it. We're bad. We're going to sit in a 4-4-2 low block and try to beat you that way. Because that's what this team has done before. The same manager with a lot of the same players has done that before. Everybody talks about that game against Atlanta after the 2018 World Cup final where Seattle killed soccer. And it's like, that team was just as talented as this team.
Right.
But because of certain circumstances and what was available to them, they had to take a very, very, very sort of pragmatic approach to get a result out of a game.
Yep.
Or try to, at least. So it's like when you take into account the sort of like naive patterns of play that I'm seeing from the Sounders coupled that with sort of like a really, really stubborn approach in player selection, and then these sort of like weird underlying numbers where it's like actually maybe they're pretty good, but they might be sort of like stuffing the ballot box a little bit in certain areas. It just doesn't make me feel good at all about something good happening here.
Yeah, I think I largely agree with you. And we'll get. I keep promising the second segment, so now we got to do a good job in it. But we'll kind of get more into that. But I do think that is a good place to call it for segment one. We will be right back. You're listening to Nos Audientes.
Watson's Counter wants to thank everyone for their patience, but now the wait is over. Located at 6420 24th Avenue Northwest in Ballard, they've reopened in a brand new location with the same bomb-ass coffee and the same dumbass vibes. You can still expect their classics like the gochujang fried chicken sandwich and Fruity Pebbles French toast, alongside their new soft serve program and their world-class coffee. Make sure to follow them on Instagram for all the latest and greatest.
Welcome back to Nos Audientes. So we talked about this earlier, and we've talked about this a lot over the last couple weeks, months. But the Sounders now have 3 weeks off. They're off until August 20th, and they'll be hosting Atlanta on August 20th. And so that's something that we characterized at times as maybe the worst case scenario from this tournament, because that's going to have an impact on sharpness. Teams that play a little bit deeper into the tournament are gonna stay in midseason form. The Sounders, this is a long enough layoff that I think you can have some concerns about that not happening. The good news is Atlanta is also out of the League's Cup. They got shellacked by Lionel Messi and pals in the first leg and lost to Cruz Azul on penalties in the second leg. So they're not going to have. This is not going to be a situation where they're up against a team that's running full throttle, right? The Atlanta has the same disadvantages that the Sounders do. The Sounders are at home, which is nice. Atlanta is not very good, which is great. It'll be a homecoming for Gonzalo Pineda. I don't believe he's been back to Seattle since then, although I think there is a chance that he will not be coming to Seattle this time around. Anyway, I'm trying to look on the positive side about this layoff here. I do think there are concerns about that long of a layoff in midseason. I think those concerns are a lot bigger when you're playing well, and the Sounders are not, as we've discussed. I think that if there is a desire in the team to try a new tactical approach, they've got 3 weeks to drill it. They are going to, I think, play some competitive friendlies during the time off. Obviously, they're not going to be playing MLS level competition, but friendly is better than a training session. I think there are some nagging injuries on the team. Jordan Morris looked better, I think, against Monterrey, but I think could use some time off. Hopefully, Christian Roldan can get himself right. Although with concussion protocol, 2 of them this close together, who knows? I'm really concerned about that. But hopefully, everything can get resolved in that period of time. So I want to get your take on this, Mark. How do you feel about this layoff? Do you think that it could potentially be a net positive, or do you think that the concerns about sharpness are still a bigger factor?
Yeah, I think anytime you do not play for 3 weeks in the middle of the season, it's not good. So under that sort of like context, I do think, although, it's not good. I would rather the Sounders are playing week in, week out to kind of iron out the kinks, because that's, you kind of talk to anybody who has worked professionally in the game, either players or coaches, they would rather just be playing games to play themselves out of the funk instead of going to a long break with the funk. Like, you never want to lose going into an international break, that kind of thing.
Right.
However, if something is a catalyst for change, you've got 20 days to figure it out now.
Yeah.
And I do kind of want to bring something to this conversation that I found really, really interesting after the Monterrey game. And it was actually that Ladero was stripped of the captaincy.
Yeah.
And that makes me think there could be something kind of brewing in the background. And, they just sort of like, they got to the Leagues Cup and they were just sort of like, it's the first Leagues Cup. Nobody really knows what this thing is. It's actually way cooler than anybody thought it was going to be. However, we stink. We're going to try to use this break as something to try something. So I do kind of like, I know we ended the first segment with me basically saying I don't think things get better, but I will say if there is a catalyst, it has to happen now. And I am going to lose my mind if it's the same approach against Atlanta as it was in the last month or so.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I think that there's no choice now but to look on the bright side for the Sounders, at least. I'm not looking on the bright side, especially, but I think if you're Brian Schmetzer, if you're the players, you have to look at this as an opportunity to get things sorted out. And you mentioned in the first segment there are all these different things they can do. And I think that one of the things that has to be on the table is dropping Nico Ladero, or at least giving him a reduced role. I also think that something that has to be on the table is dropping Raul Ruidiaz. I do not think he is the same player. I think it's been long enough since he got back from injury that this is not rustiness anymore, right? Like, I think that he is a different player now. Jordan Morris has looked great as a forward, as a out and out 9. I think it's his best position. And I think when Raul is playing at full potential, get Jordan onto the wing and get them both on the field at the same time. Raul is not playing to his full potential. He hasn't been all season. He's had multiple chances against RSL and Monterrey, and even going back to the regular season, where I think vintage Raul scores, 9 times out of 10 on multiple chances where he's not even getting close. He's got his touch seems off. He doesn't seem to have the same sort of explosiveness and acceleration. Maybe he gets this time off and he has nagging injuries and he can get back to full health and he is that player again. But I think if he's not, and they observe that in training and in the friendlies, making him an impact sub has to be under consideration. I know he's not going to like that. I don't like watching this version of Raul play. So, what's good for the goose, right? So yeah, I totally agree. I think that, there's an opportunity to change things up here that you don't normally get midseason. And a lot of the time when a team tries a new tactical approach midseason, it can take 2 or 3 games for it to really come into form. And I don't know that the Sounders really have that time. I think they've got to get this turned around very quickly. Although maybe not, because despite everything, the Sounders are still 4th place in the West. They're 8 points clear of Minnesota for that last playoff spot. They could be, I think, pretty mediocre the rest of the way. I think that they could keep up their league form over the last month or so and still get in to the playoffs. And I think that has to be the minimum acceptable bar, right? Like, I think if the Sounders can get into the playoffs, even if it's as a low seed, I don't think that you can make a coaching change going into next season, right? I mean, you can. I don't think they will. I don't think they should. I think if they miss the playoffs, everything has to be on the table. So I don't know. I still think the odds are extremely good that the Sounders are going to make the playoffs, but maybe I'm wrong. Am I wrong?
I don't think you're wrong. I mean, I think if we're kind of talking about about like where the playoffs are in terms of like expectations, I think qualifying for the playoffs at this point, kind of looking at the rest of the Western Conference, is pretty much a foregone conclusion, unless things get way worse, which is totally possible.
Yeah.
And if things get way worse, then that's entertaining in a different direction.
Right.
But I think they really got to figure out a way to do something with these last 11 games. And it's a little bit of kind of like a similar situation to the end of 2021, where they were in the hunt for the Supporter Shield and then they kind of dropped off and then they couldn't really like find themselves. And then they won like 4 of their last 11 games or 4 of their last like 12 or 13 games or something like that. And then they were just sort of kind of like listless. And then that like the, oh man, what was that RSL keeper's name? David Ochoa. The David Ochoa game happened. And that was that. So it's like this group of players, this coach, this coaching staff, and maybe even this general manager, they need to like figure out a way to like make this work, or so much is going to change next season.
Yeah.
And maybe that's already been sort of communicated to players like Nicolas Lodero or Albert Rusnak or even Raul Ruiz or Yamar or whatever. And maybe they're just like, yeah, you guys aren't, we're not going to do contract extensions for anybody. And this is that. And maybe that's the reason why they're playing poorly. I don't know. I'm not in those conversations. But even like, I look at Nicolas Lodero, right? He's obviously not the player he used to be. He's obviously not the captain anymore. He's been bad this season. He's been good at points, but it's like, if you're just going to sulk for the last 3 months of the season because nobody's given you a contract offer, like have some shame.
Yeah.
Like you are the best player this club has ever had. You are the captain to the most successful period this club has ever had. Like go out on a high note. Like where's your dignity?
Right.
If you're just going to like sort of like kick around the idea of going and playing with your buddy Luis Suarez somewhere, like just like do something. Like let us remember you for who you actually are instead of just this guy who isn't good anymore. Like it's in there somewhere. And if that's him accepting a lesser role and like being a real leader and like spurning on change that way, that's great. But it's just like, it's just really frustrating watching him sort of like run around and point fingers and ask for the ball when he's 70 yards away and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's sad to watch a player who I think does still have something to offer. I mean, I think that he's clearly not the player he thinks he is anymore, and the player that he wants to be and has been for so long. And I've never been 1/1,000,000th as successful at anything, let alone any athletic pursuits, as Nico Lodero has been. So I don't understand that mindset, right? Of having to come to terms with that. I can't get into his brain, but I know that other players who have achieved more, no disrespect to Nico, but who have achieved more in their careers have accepted, that father time is undefeated and that you maybe have to accept a less of a role. Maybe you have to change the way you play. Or you just have to kind of be a little more graceful about it than Nico has been. I don't think that I don't see what's happening in the locker room. I don't see what's happening in training, obviously. So I don't think that he's been like a problem from an attitude perspective. Like I don't necessarily get that vibe from it. But I do think like watching him go out and try to be the player he was in 2016 is extremely frustrating. And, like you said, like sort of pointing fingers about like, I want to play as the 10. Well, sorry, Nico, but you can't do that anymore. And, and I do think, it's painful, right, to see him stripped of the armband. It sucks. I don't like that it's come to that, just because he is one of my favorite players of all time. And it's a pretty sure sign that the end is near with his time at the Sounders. But I do think that it's the right decision, especially if he's not willing to take a little bit less of a prominent role. I think that, that's what Brian Schmetzer gets paid for. That's what his job is to make those difficult decisions. And so I think that that's, maybe something to be optimistic about, that he's willing to make big changes if he needs to. And I think too that, and this dovetails nicely into the next thing I wanted to talk about. I think that this probably is it for maybe not this entire core group, but for Nico, I think a good chance for Raul, I think for Rusnak. But not like this, to see them make a run at it, to see them get things turned around. maybe to win a playoff game or two, get people excited again. I think that would be really nice to see, because I do love this group of players. I mean, I think it's easy to get frustrated with the way things are now. But this team has won a lot of stuff, and they've won a trophy no other MLS team has won. So I don't want to have a sour taste in my mouth about this team.
Yeah, and I apologize if you hear the trash truck outside. I can't do anything about that. But, you know, players that come to this club, the manager, the ownership, the front office, us fans, we talk about this club being special and different. And, you know, we say things like once a Sounder, always a Sounder, and, you know, the family stuff and all of that, because we believe it. It is true. Like, this club is different than Inter Miami or RSL or the LA Galaxy or Atlanta United. Like, we have a real thing here, and we are very passionate about it, and we love it, and we're very proud of it. This club, where it's at right now, needs these players and this coaching staff and this front office to continue that right now, like literally right now for the next 3 months. It can't just sort of be like, oh, well, this season sucks, it's all going to change next season. That's
Right.
That. We're heading into an off season where there's going to be a rebrand. There's going to be the 50th anniversary of the club. You know, there's a lot of there needs to be a lot of excitement about that, because not many clubs, if any, in America get to talk about things the way that we get to talk about things.
Yeah.
And for that to be true, this group of players and this coaching staff needs to give us something going into next season. Yeah. I'm not asking, like, I think the ship has kind of sailed on trophies. We're out of
right.
We're out of the running for 3 of them, and if we're not careful, we're probably out of the running for a 4th. And I'm not just talking about, I'm not even considering the Cascadia Cup, because I don't think it's actually possible for us to win that. So maybe there's
right.
there's the sales on the 5th one. But like, this group of players, if it's not together next season, they need to give us something for the rest of this year to remember them fondly by, and to be an integral part about this club and its story. Like, they gave us one of the greatest nights of our lives last May 4th, 2022. No other MLS club has done that, and I will add, will ever do it, because things are getting different. Like, yeah. That is one of the most incredible accomplishments from an American soccer club ever. And these players need to link the future of this club to that story with some sort of performance over the next 3 months. I'm not asking for an MLS Cup. I'm asking for life, to believe in something, to get behind something, to feel something, to watch them play soccer again and like actually enjoy it.
Yeah.
Because whether you think it's been good or bad over the last year, it's not been fun at all. Bar like maybe 8 or 10 games in the span of like 50, it's been bad.
Yeah.
And they got to give us something. And it can't just be, oh, we won you that trophy almost 2 years ago at this point. Just be happy for it. Because this club has never settled for things like that.
Right. And I do think that there is a distinction between your attitude, which I completely share, right? I think that it is really frustrating watching this team be as shitty as they are, because whether or not they are the level that they have been in the past, clearly they're not. Players get older, it happens. Whether or not, and this is the next thing I wanted to talk about, so put a pin in this one, whether or not you think it was the right decision to sell out to go for CCL, and you know, whatever the outcome of that, so be it, right? Like, it sucks to watch this team play, and they should be playing better, and they should at least be trying something different. Like, that's been a theme, I think, on this episode. Don't just keep putting the same lineup out there, trying the same things, hoping that maybe it'll work this time. Like, that sucks. That's frustrating. But I think I've seen some people saying that Craig Weibel should be sacked because, this team clearly needs moves. And that's just not like, yeah, they do. They need new players. But the reality of the situation is they're up against the cap. They don't have a lot of flexibility. There's just not a whole lot they can do. Yes, they could buy out Nico Lodero or Raul Ruidiaz and sign another DP. I think for a lot of reasons Arriaga. I think there are a lot of reasons that those aren't necessarily the best decisions. And I don't think it's going to matter that much, right? Ultimately, I don't think it's going to matter that much. And I don't think it's worth the negative fallout. Like, I think if you buy out Nico Lodero in August and that's the end of his chapter in Seattle for maybe a marginal improvement over the last 10, 11 games, I just, all that stuff, that family stuff that, you can't really have that be your sort of part of your brand and do something like that. So I get why they're not doing that, but you got to do something on the pitch. Players have got to accept lesser roles, whatever it is, right? But I think that there's a suggestion I've seen that Adrian Harrer doesn't want to spend money, that the Sounders are becoming the Mariners. And I just think it is easy to lose sight of the fact that this team did just win a CCL trophy last year. They've won a lot with this group. This is a thing that happens, especially in American sports, where you have a core, you commit a lot of money and time and cap space to that core. And unless you get all of the timing exactly right, which a lot of the time entails being pretty ruthless, you're going to hit the end of a window and be caught out. So I'm torn between these two minds of being like really frustrated with the team and where things are at, and also accepting that, they kind of made a conscious decision to go for it. They won the CCL, but I do think it's worth having a conversation about. Are there things? So, A, do you still think it was worth it? I think I know the answer to that, but I'll ask it anyway. And B, are there things that they did that sort of get lumped in with that? Well, they had to do those things to win the CCL that maybe they didn't need to do, right? Like, were there extensions that they handed out that you don't think were necessary? Are there ways that they've painted themselves into a corner that maybe I'm letting them off the hook for?
Yeah, I think it was worth it. As long as this is sort of the penance for threatening the gods, so to speak.
Yeah.
I will take 18 months of turgidness if that's what that means. Of course, I'll do that again if I have to. However, I think it's really important to remember that, like, Garth Lagerwey left.
Yeah.
And he was sort of the architect of this whole thing.
Right.
And he wasn't expecting to leave, at least if we believe anything he said to Jeremiah in his sort of like reporting.
Yeah.
Of his, like, Atlanta came in with this like Godfather offer, gave him a position he was never going to get in Seattle. And that's just sort of life. And, you're insane if you turn down more money and more responsibility at a different job to stay at your current job. That's just like how it works. So maybe he had a plan for this previous offseason that made this season look a little bit different in terms of like bringing signings in and whatnot. And I think once Garth left and once they brought Craig in and gave him the job, I think they rightfully gave him the space to make minimal impact on this season if it meant the next 4 were really good.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what's happening. Like, if you kind of look at the contract situation, like, I think up to 17 players can be out of contract this offseason. So it's sort of like, that's just kind of the thing you have to do. And then, Craig Weibel does his media availability a week or 2 ago now, and he says the money's there to spend it if I need it. And it's like, okay, to me that communicates a clean slate and something Garth never really did a clean slate when he was here. It was always kind of building the plane while he flew it.
Right.
And if you're going to hire somebody like Craig Weibel and he has a vision and that vision involves sort of a reset button, then you got to let him do that. So I don't really get into are we wasting $1 million in TAM on Hebert when we could have that roster spot? Are we wasting our time not buying out Arriaga when he's clearly not coming back next season? Those minute things at this point don't matter.
Yeah.
It's just sort of like the plan for this season was to have like a healthy Christian Roldan and a healthy Jordan Morris be really good. That hasn't happened. And you just got to kind of like, that sucks. Important players get hurt on teams all the time and they become bad. Like look at the Golden State Warriors. They were bad for 2 years because Klay Thompson's Achilles and knee exploded. So it's just like, you in the situation of American sports, you deal with salary cap, you deal with things like allocation money and luxury taxes and stuff, and you just got to kind of cop for that. You just got to deal with it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that a lot of the mentality of sports fans is that if stuff is bad, you want your pound of flesh. And I've certainly, fallen prey to that a time or two, or 1,000 over my life. So I get it. But I do think you're right that Craig Weibel is in a difficult position. I think people calling for Craig Weibel's head are maybe not the most knowledgeable about the realities of now. It's fine if you think he never should have gotten the job in the first place if he wasn't qualified. I'm not sure what the case is there, but I know there are people that think that, and I'm not going to tell them they're wrong, right? But I do think if you were fine with the hire or didn't have an opinion about the hire, and now after 6 months or whatever, however long he's been in charge, you think this is all his fault. I think that maybe you need a little better understanding of the roster realities of the club. But I am always torn between wanting to be grounded and wanting to have like a realistic outlook on what what are the cap realities of the Sounders? What are, what kind of contracts do they have? What's the long-term vision? And giving them the benefit of the doubt, because I think they have earned it over the last, especially the last 15 years, but even the last 50 years, right? And also recognizing that part of the reason they have been successful all this time is because there's a very high standard set. And so it's a constant, it's a struggle for me mentally of like, I don't want to be irrational and, demand people's heads and kick all the players off the team, right? Like trade everyone. But I always want to, check in with myself of like, did they have to commit all this money to Arriaga? Did they have to give Rui Diaz the extension that they gave him? Did they have to bring Nico back this season? Right. Just because he was on the team last year. And ultimately, I think I come down where you do, which is that for me, I'm not telling anybody else how to feel or what to think, but for me, that stuff isn't important because there was a changing of the guard and now it's all about what they do going forward. If they go into a situation where they bring back Nico Ladero next year, where they bring back Albert Rusnak as a DP, and they're making those same kinds of decisions, that's when I'm probably going to get pretty pissed off. But for now, I'm going to be pissed off at the games, pissed off at the team and the coaching staff week in and week out, while still having a lot of optimism that things are going to turn around next year because they are going to have that blank slate.
Yeah, I think when you get into the like, should they have committed all the resources they did to win CCL, you have to examine the counterfactual, which is they did commit those resources. They did win CCL. So if they didn't commit all the resources, they could have not won CCL.
Right.
And we could just be talking about another MLS team that had a false dawn, and, Atlanta, LAFC, Toronto, Montreal, which is kind of a funny one to throw in there. Right. It's just like they did what they did, and what happened actually happened.
Yeah.
So like doing the like what if thing is just not really. You just can't really do that, because like what happened actually happened.
Yeah.
So where I stay rational is like, yeah, maybe they could be spending better on Arriaga's roster spot or Hebert's roster spot, or maybe a guy who never gets injured doesn't get a concussion and he's not out for 2 months. Like maybe that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But on top of all of that, I go back to like this group of players and this team with the players that are available right now, even if Christian Roldan doesn't play again this season, which he probably shouldn't given the situation he's in.
I agree, unfortunately.
They're good enough to give us something. And it doesn't have to be a trophy. Like it doesn't have to be. It can be something else. It can be like just pride.
Right.
Like actual fight, because that we're not seeing any of that. Really. Yeah. We're getting shellacked left, right, and center. And it's just sort of like, oh, we'll be better next game.
Yeah.
It's
and
like
when we do win games, it's not fun.
Yeah. Or it's just sort of like the games that are fun end up being bad because they seemingly can't attack and defend at the same time, which is crazy.
Yeah.
So it's just sort of like all of that like crazy stuff, like cap and DPs and all that, like it doesn't matter right now.
Yeah.
Like who should be the GM, who isn't the GM. It's just like there's a group of players that has won stuff together that can do something with the rest of this season. And it's up to the coach and the players to deliver us something. If they don't, then we have that conversation. Then we go to those places. But it's just sort of like, I want to watch Sounders games. I'm going to watch every game for the rest of the season. I want to have a good time doing so.
Yeah.
I don't think that is an unreasonable expectation.
Yeah,
because they gave it to me. They gave that expectation to me.
Right. Yeah, you never want watching sports to become an obligation, right? And like you and I and Jeremiah and other folks obviously are in a slightly different situation, because like if I wasn't doing this podcast, if Jeremiah wasn't writing about the Sounders as a full-time job, if you weren't, writing about the Sounders as a side gig, I won't speak for you or Jeremiah. I would not be watching this many games. It would not be appointment viewing for me. It certainly wouldn't be the kind of thing that I avoid spoiling for myself and watching later, or watching. I watched the RSL game knowing the score, right? Like that sucks to do. So for other folks, it's not as much of an obligation, but I think people do like when the Sounders are good, they mean a lot to people. And yeah, you're totally right. That's all it would take for me to feel okay about the season, was just have some fight down the stretch, put together a couple of good games. Don't let this group go out with a whimper, because the point you make about it did happen, I think is the key takeaway for me, right? Like without the CCL trophy, I don't know how I feel about this group of players. They won 2 MLS Cups. That's a great accomplishment. But I think you could make a case that that's underachieving with this group, right? Like, or at least
also lost 2. So
yeah, they did lose 2. They had some pretty bad stretches. Yeah, without that CCL trophy, we're not talking about them the way we talk about like the Robbie Keane era Galaxy. Right, they're more like the Josie Altidore era TFC, which is not bad. Like that's a good run. The CCL trophy is what puts them into that level, those hallowed halls of some of the best teams in league history. And so I think I'm okay with putting up with bad results. What I'm not okay with is putting up with what we've been putting up with so far this year.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think it's irrational to just say flat out it's unacceptable.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to get into an XG debate or who should be starting at striker or roster construction, to just flat out say, like, this season has not been fun for most of it. You don't have to defend a group of games that were actually fun but they didn't win, or blah, blah. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, it's not fun. They gave us the expectation earlier this season. They told us it was going to be fun. It hasn't been. So it's up to them to tell us what the rest of the season's going to be. And I don't think it's irrational to say, like, hey, things haven't gone as we thought it would go. That's fine. I can accept that. Things happen, especially injuries.
Yeah.
But if we're going to do 11 games like we did at the end of 2021, limp into the playoffs, lose in the first round at home, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
I can't, like, nobody, that is such a bad precedent to set again.
Yeah. So
it's just sort of like, it's up to you. It's up to them to figure it out, to do something with whatever kind of limited stuff they got, vibes or whatever they got left in the tank, and just do it.
Yeah. Mark, I completely agree. And I also think that's a great note to end it on. Thank you for joining me. Always a pleasure. It's always fun to do these with you, and always a little bit of fun for me to sit in the host chair. I will say that with the 3-week layoff, I'm not sure when we'll be back. I haven't talked to Jeremiah about this, so who knows? Maybe we will do shows every week, but I'm not sure. So he's probably got some stuff planned as well that I don't know about, because he's just such a busy little bee. I want to thank all of our sponsors: Full Pull Wines, Watson's Counter. I almost said Verity Credit Union, which is very funny.
Were they a sponsor a long time ago?
A very long time ago.
Okay.
But hey, thanks to them for doing that. But not as much as Full Pull Wines and Watson's Counter, who are still our sponsors. And of course, thanks to our subscribers. We love you so much, and you're so wonderful. That's going to do it. I have in the past said Jeremiah's sign off, and I'm not going to do it because it feels weird to me. So I will just say thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
We love you.